What if everything you thought you knew about history's most famous kings and queens was only half the story? Behind the polished portraits and grand legends, these rulers carried secrets, quirks, scandals, and astonishing choices that never made it into the textbooks. Picture this: a queen who secretly practiced alchemy in her private chambers, a king who outlawed sliced bread because he believed it caused illness, or a royal who kept a pet lion at court. These aren't fairy tales, they're real, untold slices of history waiting to be uncovered. For centuries, the lives of monarchs have been wrapped in velvet and gold, their stories polished for public consumption. But peel back those layers and you'll find something far more human and far more fascinating. These weren't just figureheads on thrones. They were people with obsessions, fears, and eccentricities that shaped empires in ways you'd never expect. Today, we're stepping off the well-trodden path of history to reveal 25 jaw-dropping facts about legendary kings and queens, each one more surprising than the last. Think about the last time a historical fact made you pause and say, "Wait, really?" That's the feeling we're chasing here. Because history isn't just dates and battles, it's a collection of unbelievable, messy, and utterly human stories. From a ruler who waged war over a stolen chicken to another who banned high heels to prevent accidents at court, these details rewrite what we assume about power and the people who held it. So settle in, you're about to see crowns and kingdoms in a whole new light, and trust us, by the end, you'll never look at history the same way again. Cleopatra wasn't just a legendary queen, she was a linguistic genius. While most rulers of her dynasty clung to Greek, the language of their ancestors, she shattered expectations by mastering 9 languages, including Egyptian. That might not sound groundbreaking today, but in ancient Alexandria it was revolutionary. The Ptolemaic rulers before her had kept their distance from the people they ruled, clinging to Greek customs and refusing to even speak the local tongue. But Cleopatra, she immersed herself, fluent in everything from Ethiopian to Hebrew, Aramaic to Latin. She could converse with diplomats, scholars, and soldiers in their own words, no translator needed. This wasn't just about impressing visitors at court. Her multilingual skills were a weapon. When Julius Caesar first arrived in Egypt, he expected to deal with yet another sheltered royal. Instead, he met a queen who addressed him in flawless Latin before he'd even uttered a word. That moment changed everything. By speaking Rome's language literally and politically, she positioned herself as Caesar's equal, not a supplicant. Later, when Mark Antony summoned regional leaders to demand tribute, Cleopatra stunned him by answering each envoy in their native tongue. Imagine the shock of a diplomat from Parthia or Armenia hearing their own language from an Egyptian queen. It wasn't just diplomacy, it was psychological dominance, but her most strategic language choice wasn't Latin or Greek, it was Egyptian. By embracing the speech of her subjects, she became the first Ptolemy to truly connect with the people. While her predecessors hid behind palace walls, she spoke directly to priests in temple hieroglyphics, bargained with merchants in demotic script, and won loyalty by showing respect where others had shown disdain. That's how a foreign dynasty held onto power for centuries, not just with armies but with words, and no one wielded them better than Cleopatra. Henry VIII is remembered for his 6 tumultuous marriages and reshaping England's religious landscape, but few know he was also a gifted musician who composed songs that still survive today. While history paints him as a larger-than-life figure wielding power and wrath, there was another side to the king, a man who found solace in music, strumming his lute by candlelight and penning melodies that captured the spirit of his court. His most famous composition, Pastime with Good Company, wasn't just a ditty, it was a window into how Henry saw himself. The lyrics celebrated merriment, feasting, and loyalty, themes that mirrored his early reign's lavish tournaments and banquets before the darker turns of his rule. Music wasn't just a hobby for Henry, it was political. In an era when royals were expected to master the arts as proof of their refinement, his skill with the lute and virginal, an early keyboard, set him apart. He filled his court with musicians, commissioning instruments and even hiring an entire choir to follow him on progresses through the countryside. Records show he owned 72 lutes at one point, and his personal songbook included pieces by Europe's finest composers alongside his own works. Imagine the scene: the king, fingers dancing across strings, performing for ambassadors to showcase England's cultural sophistication. It was soft power in action, proving his kingdom wasn't some barbaric outpost but a rival to the glittering courts of France and Spain. What makes Pastime with Good Company so revealing is its contrast to Henry's later reputation. Written in his youth, it's buoyant and charming, a far cry from the paranoid ruler who would later execute friends and wives. The melody, still played by early music ensembles today, feels almost disarming in its cheerfulness, yet even here there's a hint of the king's iron will. The song dismisses idle folks who shun revelry, a subtle jab at critics who frowned on his extravagance. Music for Henry was never just entertainment, it was a declaration. And 500 years later, those notes still whisper the ambitions of a king who saw himself as both warrior and artist. Catherine the Great ruled Russia with an iron will, expanding its borders and modernizing its culture, yet centuries later, she's often remembered for a scandal that never even happened. The infamous rumor that she died in a compromising encounter with a horse is one of history's most persistent lies, a piece of propaganda so outrageous it overshadowed her real achievements. So how did this myth take root? The answer lies in the anxieties and prejudices of her enemies. Catherine was a German-born empress who seized power from her own husband, Peter III, in a coup. That alone made her a target for noble factions who resented her influence. But what really fueled the fire was her openness about taking lovers, something male rulers did without consequence, but which turned her into a lightning rod for moral panic. The horse myth didn't emerge during her lifetime. It sprouted in the salons of Paris years after her death, where exiled Russian aristocrats and satirical pamphleteers spun grotesque tales to undermine her legacy. To understand why this particular slander stuck, you have to picture 18th century Europe's obsession with decorum. A woman wielding absolute power was already seen as unnatural. Painting her as depraved made her reign seem monstrous. The story spread like wildfire, repeated in whispers and printed in underground libels, crude, illicit pamphlets that were the tabloids of their day. Never mind that Catherine actually died of a stroke in her bed, surrounded by advisors. The lie was juicier, and it played perfectly into the hands of those who wanted her remembered as a tyrant, not a trailblazer. What's most revealing is how the myth reflects deeper fears. Catherine's real sin wasn't scandal, it was competence. She corresponded with Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire, reformed Russia's legal code, and annexed Crimea. For nobles who clung to tradition, her strides toward modernization threatened their privilege. The horse tale reduced her to a punchline, diverting attention from her political savvy. Even today, the persistence of this absurd rumor shows how easily a woman's accomplishments can be overshadowed by manufactured outrage. Catherine's reign stretched over 3 decades, yet one fabricated story nearly erased her true legacy, proof that history isn't just written by the winners, but sometimes hijacked by the bitterest losers. Louis XIV didn't just rule France, he danced it into glory. Long before he became the Sun King, young Louis was pirouetting across stages, performing in over 40 ballets by the age of 30. Imagine the spectacle: Europe's most powerful monarch, draped in silk and gold, leaping alongside professional dancers as the god Apollo himself. This wasn't just royal indulgence, it was a masterclass in political theater. Every plie, every grand jeté was a calculated move to cement his authority. In an era when kings were expected to embody divine grace, Louis didn't just sit on a throne, he proved his godlike prowess with his feet. Ballet at Versailles wasn't entertainment, it was propaganda. Louis's most famous role, the Sun King, wasn't chosen by accident. As Apollo, he spun myths into reality, his glittering costumes and precise movements reinforcing the idea that he was the literal center of France's universe. Courtiers whispered that his dancing radiated the same perfection as his rule, a carefully crafted illusion. Even the strict geometric patterns of ballet formations mirrored his vision of absolute monarchy, every dancer in their place, every movement controlled. When nobles grumbled about his centralizing power, they were invited to performances where they'd watch him, resplendent, commanding the stage like the state. Resistance seemed petty in the face of such artistry, but Louis's obsession reshaped more than politics, it reinvented ballet itself. Before his reign, dance was a loose collection of folk steps. He turned it into a high art, founding the Académie Royale de Danse, the precursor to today's Paris Opera Ballet. His codified 5 positions of the feet are still the foundation of every ballet class worldwide. Even more startling, he performed publicly until his 40s, a shocking commitment for a ruler when most kings hid behind ceremony. The message was clear: Louis didn't just wear his crown, he earned it with every disciplined step. By the time age forced him to retire from the stage, ballet had become a symbol of French cultural supremacy, and his legend was set in motion quite literally. Elizabeth I's famously pale complexion wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a carefully constructed mask to hide the scars of a brush with death. In 1562, the 29-year-old queen contracted smallpox, a disease so vicious it killed her lady-in-waiting and left Elizabeth herself clinging to life. When she recovered, her face bore the pockmarks that marked countless survivors, but for a ruler whose image was her power, this was more than a personal tragedy, it was a political crisis. Portraits had to show an ageless, flawless monarch, a symbol of England's divine favor. So Elizabeth turned to the cosmetics of her era, layering on a thick, white paste made of vinegar, egg whites, and ceruse, a lethal blend of lead and vinegar that gave her the desired ghostly pallor while slowly poisoning her. The irony is crushing. The very substance that restored Elizabeth's public image may have hastened her decline. Lead poisoning causes muscle weakness, hair loss, and neurological damage, symptoms that mirrored the Queen's later years when her hands trembled and she suffered violent mood swings. Yet even as her health faltered, she refused to abandon the makeup. Every morning, her ladies-in-waiting would mix fresh ceruse, applying it not just to her face but her neck and décolletage, transforming her into a living porcelain doll. The effect was striking. Against the stark white, her fiery red wig and jewel-encrusted gowns glowed even brighter, a visual metaphor for her nickname, Gloriana. But behind the spectacle was a woman enduring private agony, her skin cracking and peeling under the toxic layers. This wasn't mere vanity, it was statecraft. In an age before photography, a monarch's portrait was their immortality. Elizabeth understood that every scratch on her face could be seen as a crack in England's armor. When foreign ambassadors reported her mask of youth, they weren't just describing her appearance, they were reinforcing the myth of her eternal vigor, a queen untouched by time. Even on her deathbed at 69, she reportedly demanded a mirror to ensure her image held. The lead-laden makeup that preserved her legend may have stolen years from her life, but for Elizabeth the calculus was clear: better to rule as an icon than fade as a mortal. And in that choice she revealed the brutal price of power, one painted in strokes of white and poison. Frederick the Great of Prussia built his reputation on discipline and military might. His army was the envy of Europe, his battle strategies legendary. But beneath the stern uniform beat the heart of a musician. Late at night, when courtiers assumed he was reviewing troop movements, he'd slip away to his private chambers, pick up his flute, and lose himself in melodies by Bach and Quantz. This wasn't just a hobby, it was rebellion. His father, Frederick William I, had famously despised the arts, once beating his son with a cane for catching him playing music. The king called musicians useless parasites and burned his son's flute books in front of him. Yet instead of crushing Frederick's passion, the cruelty only drove it underground and onto the throne. Once in power, Frederick turned his love of music into a quiet revolution. At Sanssouci Palace, his summer retreat, he transformed a small golden chamber into a concert hall. There, with the curtains drawn to muffle the sound, he'd perform alongside Europe's finest musicians. They came not just for the prestige of playing for a king, but for his genuine talent. His teacher, Johann Joachim Quantz, wrote that Frederick's playing had uncommon precision and feeling, a startling contrast to the rigid precision of his military campaigns. Even Voltaire, no fan of Prussia, admitted the king's flute could make stones weep. But these concerts were more than personal indulgence, they were political theater in reverse. While Louis XIV used ballet to showcase power, Frederick used chamber music to humanize it. Foreign ambassadors expecting a warmonger found themselves disarmed by a king who discussed philosophy between sonatas. His flute became a diplomatic tool, softening Prussia's image without weakening its armies. And in a sly jab at his father's legacy, he composed over 100 flute concertos, ensuring music flourished in the very court that had tried to silence it. The man who waged wars by day became, by candlelight, the composer who proved even the sternest ruler needs beauty to breathe. What's most striking is how Frederick compartmentalized his passions. The same hands that penned delicate concertos signed orders for brutal campaigns. He never saw a contradiction. To him, art and war were two sides of a disciplined mind. Years later, when Napoleon occupied Berlin, he made a point of visiting Frederick's grave. Standing before the tomb, the French emperor reportedly murmured, "If he were alive, I would not be here." A fitting epitaph for a king whose flute whispered as powerfully as his cannons roared. Marie Antoinette's glittering court at Versailles wasn't just about silk gowns and champagne towers. It had a dark undercurrent of dice rolls and card games where fortunes vanished in a single evening. While France teetered on the brink of financial collapse, the Queen was losing staggering sums at the gaming tables, once blowing the equivalent of a full year's palace budget in a single night. This wasn't casual entertainment, it was a compulsion. Her private gambling salon, the Salon des Dieux, became a vortex where nobles piled up debts alongside their sovereign, betting sums that could feed entire villages for months. The irony was cruel. As bread riots erupted in Paris over flour shortages, Antoinette's closest circle treated money like confetti, tossing it away on faro and whist. What makes her losses so shocking isn't just the amounts, it's the timing. The late 1770s were a tinderbox of revolutionary unrest, with the royal treasury already drained by wars and poor harvests. Yet Antoinette's account books reveal payments to courtiers covering her gambling markers, essentially using state funds to settle private debts. One particularly disastrous evening saw her lose 150,000 livres, enough to build a small chateau, to the Duc de Chartres, a rival who relished humiliating the monarchy. Worse still, these games weren't even secret. Servants reported clattering carts of gold coins being wheeled to pay winners, while the Queen laughed off concerns with her infamous mantra, "Let them eat cake," a phrase historians now believe was never actually spoken, but which perfectly encapsulates the optics of her excess. Gambling wasn't just a vice for Marie Antoinette, it was political suicide. Every louis d'or lost at cards became ammunition for revolutionary pamphleteers who portrayed her as a wastrel bleeding France dry. The truth was more nuanced. Isolated in a foreign court surrounded by sycophants, the Queen used high-stakes games to forge alliances and soothe loneliness. But nuance doesn't spark revolutions. When the Bastille fell in 1789, those same gambling partners would abandon her, leaving the Queen to face the guillotine alone, a stark reminder that in the end the house always wins. And in Versailles' Grand Casino, the ultimate price wasn't gold but a crown. Nero didn't just want to rule the Roman Empire, he wanted to conquer the Olympic Games. In 67 AD, the emperor staged one of history's most shameless displays of vanity, bribing judges to declare him victor in the chariot race despite a humiliating public failure. Picture the scene. Nero, more accustomed to lounging in palaces than handling horses, clambered onto a 10-horse chariot. 4 was standard in a grotesque overcompensation of skill. Within moments, he lost control, tumbling onto the dirt as his vehicle careened away. Any other competitor would have been disqualified, but Nero wasn't just an athlete. He was the man who held Greece's fate in his hands, and he'd paid for a victory, not a performance. The extent of his cheating was brazen even by ancient standards. Judges, fearing execution or seduced by sacks of gold, awarded him the olive wreath as if his calamitous fall had been intentional, a stunt to thrill the crowd. They even postponed the games by a year to accommodate his tour of Greece, where he competed in events ranging from singing to tragedy, categories he added himself. Every victory was prearranged, every competitor quietly paid to lose. When his lyre strings snapped during a music contest, officials still proclaimed him champion, insisting the mishap enhanced the artistry. The Greeks, dependent on Rome's favor, played along, but the farce left a stain. One contemporary historian dryly noted that Nero won every crown yet earned none. What makes this scandal more than ancient gossip is what it reveals about absolute power's corruption. Nero didn't crave glory, he demanded validation. Earlier emperors had competed in games discreetly, but Nero insisted on being seen as a godlike polymath. His Olympic charade coincided with Rome's worst fiscal crisis in decades as he drained the treasury to fund his Hellenic fantasy. After his death, the Senate declared damnatio memoriae, scrubbing his name from records, but the lesson lingered. When leaders confuse authority with talent, reality itself becomes negotiable. And in Nero's case, the only thing more broken than his chariot was the system that let him pretend he'd fixed it. Queen Victoria never set foot in India, but thanks to one man, its flavors became a staple on her royal table and eventually across Britain. In 1887, the monarch hired Abdul Karim, a 24-year-old clerk from Agra, not just as a servant but as her personal munshi or teacher. While history remembers him for sparking controversies at court, few know his quiet culinary revolution. Karim didn't just instruct Victoria in Urdu, he introduced her to rich, aromatic curries, transforming Windsor Castle's bland menus with dishes like chicken vindaloo and spiced lentils. The Queen, notoriously picky with food, became so enamored that she had a special curry kitchen built at Osborne House where Karim's creations simmered daily. This wasn't mere exotic novelty. Victoria's embrace of Indian cuisine reflected a shrewd political instinct. As Empress of India, she recognized that food could be diplomacy. When Indian dignitaries visited, she'd proudly serve Karim's dishes, signaling respect for their culture. The gesture wasn't lost on her guests. Here was the most powerful woman in the world, eating with her hands from silver tholies, asking for second helpings of dal. Meanwhile, her courtiers seethed. They dismissed the curries as peasant food and mocked the Queen's enthusiasm, but Victoria ignored them. She even awarded Karim land in India and a pension, honors unheard of for a colonial subject at the time. The ripple effects were enormous. As Britain's industrial cities swelled with Indian immigrants in the late 19th century, curry houses began dotting London's East End, many run by Karim's countrymen, who found unexpected credibility in rumors that the Queen herself craved their food. By the 1950s, chicken tikka masala would surpass fish and chips as Britain's national dish, a twist of history Karim likely never imagined. Yet the real surprise isn't how Indian cuisine conquered Britain. It's that a homesick young clerk, far from the spices of his homeland, became the unlikely architect of that conquest. And in Windsor's archives, his handwritten recipes still survive, stained with turmeric and cloves, tiny, flavorful acts of rebellion that changed a nation's palate forever. Charlemagne ruled an empire that stretched across modern-day France, Germany, and Italy, a colossus of territory welded together by his military genius. Yet this towering figure, who revived learning in the so-called Dark Ages, couldn't so much as sign his own name. Illiteracy might have crippled a lesser ruler, but Charlemagne turned it into fuel for one of history's great ironies, an emperor who couldn't read, yet became the patron saint of education. Every night after feasts and councils, he'd place a wax tablet beneath his pillow, struggling to trace letters by candlelight in a bid to conquer the skill that eluded him. His fingers, so deft at wielding a sword, fumbled with the stylus, but where he failed personally, he succeeded spectacularly for his realm, by surrounding himself with the brightest minds of the age and demanding they lift Europe from ignorance. The royal court at Aachen became a beacon of scholarship, not despite Charlemagne's illiteracy, but because of it. Like a man dying of thirst digging wells for others, he imported scholars from Italy, Spain, and England, offering fortunes for their knowledge. Alcuin of York, his chief advisor, reformed the entire educational system, standardizing the script we now call Carolingian minuscule, the ancestor of today's lowercase letters. Monasteries, which had hoarded books like dragons guarding gold, were ordered to open schools, and Charlemagne, he listened. Though he couldn't decipher the texts himself, he'd have manuscripts read aloud for hours, absorbing their wisdom through sheer force of will. His personal library, filled with works by Augustine and Cicero, was the most extensive since Rome's fall, a treasure he admired like a blind art collector, valuing beauty he couldn't see. What's most striking isn't the contradiction of an illiterate educator, but how he weaponized his insecurity. While other conquerors burned books, Charlemagne stockpiled them, as if paper could compensate for the words he couldn't write. His infamous Admonitio Generales decree of 789 ordered priests to teach reading in every village, planting the seeds for Europe's intellectual revival. Even his children weren't spared. His daughters studied astronomy alongside needlework, his sons philosophy as well as warfare. The man who joked that he knew the feel of a sword better than the shape of a letter, built an empire where ink flowed as freely as wine. And when scholars presented him with freshly copied manuscripts, he'd run his hands over the pages, tracing their crisp grooves as if touch could unlock their secrets. In the end, his legacy wasn't a signature, but thousands of literate subjects and the radical idea that a ruler's greatness could be measured not by what he took, but by what he gave others the tools to achieve. Catherine de' Medici didn't just walk into French history, she towered over it, quite literally, on a pair of heels that reshaped European fashion forever. When the Italian-born queen arrived in France in 1533 for her marriage to the future Henry II, she brought more than political savvy. She carried a secret weapon in her trousseau, 2-inch-high platform shoes crafted by Florentine cobblers to compensate for her modest stature. At barely 5 feet tall, Catherine was dwarfed by the French court's towering nobility, a physical disadvantage that could have made her a laughingstock. But where others might have resigned themselves to whispers, she turned footwear into a power play. Within months, her slender, curved heels became the rage of Paris, copied by aristocrats desperate to mimic the Queen's newfound elevation. What began as a practical solution quickly morphed into a cultural phenomenon. Catherine's heels weren't just shoes, they were propaganda. By the 1550s, her signature style had evolved into even more extravagant designs, with red soles, a precursor to modern luxury brands, and intricate embroidery that signaled wealth and status. She reportedly wore them to every major state event, including her husband's coronation, ensuring all eyes and all portraits captured her as a figure of commanding presence. The message was clear: height equaled authority. Soon, even King Henry adopted heels for official ceremonies, sparking a gender-blind trend that saw French noblemen teetering on 3-inch lifts well into the next century. The real stroke of genius, Catherine understood fashion's psychological grip. As regent for her young sons after Henry's death, she used heels to assert dominance in a male-dominated court. When she received ambassadors, the click of her heels on palace floors announced her arrival before she spoke a word. Chroniclers noted how she'd pause at doorways, forcing taller men to bow just to meet her gaze. By the time Louis XIV, another vertically challenged monarch, claimed the throne, heels had become so synonymous with power that he issued edicts reserving the highest designs for royalty. But Catherine's legacy wasn't just about vanity. Those early heels, stiff and impractical, forced wearers to move slowly and deliberately, a physical manifestation of aristocratic grace. In an era when commoners rushed through muddy streets in flat shoes, nobles glided above the fray, their elevated souls proof they never needed to hurry. Today, when we see red carpet celebrities or executives in stilettos, we're witnessing the echo of a queen who understood that sometimes the most effective throne isn't a chair, it's the ground beneath your feet, reshaped to lift you closer to the heavens. Ivan the Terrible's reign was marked by brutality and paranoia, but beneath the bloodstains lies one of history's most tantalizing literary mysteries. Hidden somewhere beneath the Kremlin's labyrinthine corridors, or perhaps walled up in a forgotten monastery, the Tsar's legendary library is said to hold treasures that would rewrite classical scholarship, original manuscripts by Aristotle, lost plays of Sophocles, and even Hebrew texts from the Library of Alexandria. Unlike other royal collections that were catalogued and displayed, Ivan's books vanished shortly after his death in 1584, leaving behind only cryptic references in diplomats' letters and the fevered dreams of archaeologists. The library's origin story reads like a thriller. Ivan's grandmother, Sophia Palaeologina, was a Byzantine princess who fled Constantinople's fall with a trove of ancient texts, some smuggled out in grain sacks as Ottoman soldiers stormed the city. These heirlooms passed to Ivan, who added to them by extorting books from European envoys and raiding the libraries of conquered cities. A German merchant visiting Moscow in the 1560s described shelves groaning under the weight of Greek codices, their leather bindings stamped with gold. Yet within a generation, the entire collection had disappeared. Some speculate Ivan, fearing witchcraft, sealed the books behind brickwork. Others believe they were looted during the time of troubles, scattered across monasteries where illiterate monks used the priceless pages to patch roofs. Modern searches have bordered on obsession. When Napoleon occupied Moscow in 1812, his soldiers tore apart the Kremlin searching for the library, convinced it held military secrets. Stalin later authorized digs beneath Red Square, hoping Marxist scholars would uncover proof of Russia's cultural superiority. Even today, ground-penetrating radar and infrared scans periodically revive hope, most recently in 2017, when a team claimed to detect anomalous voids beneath a 16th-century church. But the truth is, Ivan's library may be less a physical treasure than a metaphor for knowledge itself, endlessly pursued, occasionally glimpsed, but never fully possessed. What makes this mystery endure isn't just the potential literary gold mine, it's the irony. A ruler who blinded architects to keep his palace designs secret, who murdered his own heir in a fit of rage, might have inadvertently preserved wisdom far older than his crimes. If those shelves still exist, they'd be a time capsule from the ancient world, hidden by a man who burned cities but couldn't bring himself to burn books. And so the hunt continues, not just for parchment and ink, but for the ghost of a tyrant who, in his final moments, might have realized that real power doesn't come from fear, it comes from the words we leave behind. Helena of Aquitaine didn't just govern her vast territories, she brought a justice system with her, quite literally, in the form of a rolling prison that followed her court across Europe. Picture the scene as the Queen's entourage moved between castles in Poitiers, Bordeaux, and Rouen. A grim procession of iron-barred wagons rumbled behind, carrying nobles who dared challenge her authority. This wasn't just punishment, it was psychological warfare on wheels. Unlike kings who locked rebels in remote dungeons, Elena made her captives part of the spectacle, their humiliation visible to every peasant and lord who lined the roads to watch her pass. The logistics alone were staggering. Historical accounts describe custom-built prison carts with reinforced oak frames and chains riveted directly to the floors, designed to endure months of travel. Elena's stewards kept meticulous records of each prisoner's ration allowance, enough bread and water to keep them alive but never comfortable. More chilling than the physical confinement was the strategic staging. When the convoy stopped at towns, the queen would hold court in the central square, deliberating over petitions and disputes while the shackled nobles watched from their cages, a living reminder of what happened to those who crossed her. Some captives, like the rebellious Lord of Lusignan, were paraded through their own former domains, their degradation witnessed by the very people they'd once ruled. What makes this tactic so revealing is how it inverted medieval power dynamics. Normally, imprisoned nobles retained dignity through isolation, their suffering hidden behind castle walls. Elena weaponized visibility. By dragging her enemies across the countryside like carnival attractions, she stripped them of the mystique that protected aristocracy. Contemporary chroniclers noted how ordinary subjects would jeer at the caged lords, upending the feudal hierarchy with every thrown rotten vegetable. Yet there was cunning beneath the cruelty. Many captives eventually swore renewed oaths of loyalty, their wills broken not by torture but by the unbearable erosion of status. The mobile prison also served as a perverse diplomatic tool. When foreign emissaries came to negotiate, Elena would pointedly stroll past the wagons during discussions, letting the clinking chains underscore her resolve. Even her estranged husband, Henry II of England, reportedly blanched upon seeing her traveling menagerie of the disobedient. For a queen whose reign spanned the tumultuous 12th century, when nobles viewed female rule as weakness, this grotesque caravan was her answer, proof that she could bend even the proudest barons to her will. And in the end, the message endured long after the wagons rotted away. Challenge Elena at your peril, and know that defeat won't come with dignity but with an audience. King George III's descent into apparent madness has been dissected for centuries, but few realize one of the most visible symptoms was literally flowing down the palace drains. The monarch's urine turned a startling shade of blue-purple, not from supernatural curses, but a rare metabolic disorder called porphyria. Modern analysis of medical records reveals how this biological quirk became a political time bomb. Every royal physician's note from 1788 onward describes the king's deeply discolored chamber pots, their contents resembling spoiled wine. To a superstitious court, this wasn't just unusual, it was evidence of divine disfavor. Porphyria's cruel genius lies in how it mimics madness while attacking the body. The disease disrupts heme production, causing toxins to accumulate and leach into bodily fluids. Beyond the violet urine, George suffered from crippling abdominal pain, muscle weakness, and most damaging to his reputation, bursts of erratic behavior. During particularly severe episodes, he'd speak incessantly for hours, foam at the mouth, and address oak trees as if they were foreign ambassadors. But it was the stained linens that became court gossip, with servants whispering about his bewitched water. The color itself came from porphyrin molecules oxidizing in light, transforming from amber to mauve after minutes of exposure, a macabre magic trick played by biochemistry. The repercussions extended far beyond palace walls. As Napoleon's armies threatened Europe, Britain needed a steady monarch, not one whose illness fueled caricatures of instability. Political cartoons depicted George's chamber pot as a swirling cauldron of royal folly, while radical pamphleteers claimed the purple hue proved he was possessed by American demons, a reference to losing the colonies. Even his physicians contributed to the hysteria, prescribing straitjackets and isolation instead of recognizing the physical roots of his suffering. What makes this case so pivotal is how it changed medical history. George's symptoms became the template for diagnosing porphyria centuries later, with 20th century researchers poring over his doctor's notes like detectives. Yet the greater tragedy might be how a king who championed agricultural reform and founded the Royal Academy of Arts became reduced to Mad King George in popular memory, not because of his policies, but because of what color his urine turned when the sunlight hit it. In the end, the monarch who ruled during the Enlightenment fell victim to the very superstitions the era sought to dispel, his legacy forever tinted by a biological fluke he couldn't control. Empress Wu Zetian didn't just break the glass ceiling of imperial China, she reshaped the entire foundation of power by turning poetry into a political weapon. At a time when most rulers measured strength in armies and taxes, Wu introduced an unexpected requirement for government officials. They had to prove their worth not with swords or silver, but with verse. Imagine the scene: hardened military generals and seasoned bureaucrats hunched over parchment, sweating as they composed rhyming couplets under the watchful eye of palace examiners. This wasn't a frivolous arts initiative, it was a calculated move to dismantle the old boys' club of Tang dynasty politics. The poetry exams were revolutionary in their simplicity and brutality. Candidates were given themes like the virtue of humility or the impermanence of power, forced to weave classical allusions into flawless meter within strict time limits. Wu's grading system was notoriously subjective. A single misplaced character or clumsy metaphor could doom even the most connected aristocrat's career. Overnight, generations of privilege meant nothing if you couldn't craft a decent quatrain. What seemed like cultural pretension was actually meritocracy disguised as art. By shifting promotions from hereditary status to demonstrated skill, Wu undercut the northern noble families who'd long monopolized court positions. Her exams became the ultimate equalizer. A peasant's son with a gift for words could now outrank a duke with a tin ear for rhythm. But Wu's motive wasn't purely altruistic. Poetry served as her loyalty test. Subjects like the willow bending in storm winds were thinly veiled probes for political flexibility. Those who praised the tree's resilience were subtly endorsing her controversial reign. Officials quickly learned to embed flattery in their verses, with the most cunning composing odes comparing Wu to legendary sage rulers. The system became self-reinforcing. The better you praised the empress in iambic pentameter, the higher you climbed. The ripple effects transformed Chinese governance for centuries. Wu's emphasis on literary skill laid groundwork for the imperial examination system that would endure until 1905. Even after her death, the idea that a ruler should value eloquence over brute force persisted, a radical notion in any age. And in a final twist of irony, the woman history remembers for her ruthless climb to power may have left her most lasting legacy not in blood or battle, but in the quiet power of well-chosen words. The exam halls she built became temples to a simple truth: those who can command language command empires. Richard the Lionheart's legendary ransom wasn't just a king's freedom at stake, it was an entire kingdom stripped bare. When Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI demanded 150,000 silver marks for the captive monarch's release in 1193, the sum wasn't merely extravagant, it amounted to a quarter of England's entire yearly wealth. To grasp the scale, imagine a modern nation emptying its coffers to pay $4 trillion for a single man, but coins didn't materialize from thin air. The machinery of extraction that funded Richard's freedom left scars deeper than any battlefield wound, revealing how desperately medieval monarchs leaned on their subjects' backs. The tax collectors who fanned across England operated with brutal efficiency. Chroniclers describe blank charters, documents signed by nobles under duress, granting the crown unchecked authority to seize property. Churches were stripped of silver chalices and candlesticks melted down into ingots. Peasants faced the Saladin tithe, a tax originally levied for the Crusades but now twisted into a domestic shakedown. Even wool exports, the lifeblood of England's economy, were commandeered mid-shipment, leaving merchants bankrupt. The ransom's weight fell heaviest on the Jewish community, where moneylenders were imprisoned until families surrendered their savings. In York, a mob incited by royal agents burned the city's Jewish quarter after residents refused payments, killing those who barricaded themselves inside the castle. What made this financial siege remarkable wasn't just its scale, but its innovation. Richard's mother, Elena of Aquitaine, personally oversaw the fundraising, pioneering what we'd now call austerity measures. She ordered a census of every plough, every sheep, every barrel of ale, taxing them at rates that would have seemed fictional years earlier. When coin ran short, towns paid in grain, livestock, even roofing lead pride from cathedral roofs. The psychological toll was calculated. By making every subject feel the ransom's pinch, the crown ensured no one would question Richard's worth. The cruel irony. The king, who became a chivalric icon for his crusader bravery, spent only 6 months of his decade-long reign in England. While ballads celebrated his release, villages starved under the debt's shadow. Some taxes lingered for generations, becoming permanent fixtures of royal finance. And when Richard finally returned, his first act wasn't gratitude, it was launching another costly war against France, funded by the same exhausted populace. The ransom didn't just buy a king's freedom, it exposed a truth as old as crowns themselves, that to rulers, even the most beloved, subjects were ultimately human coinage, spendable, replaceable, and always expected to give more than they had. Isabella of Castile didn't just send armies into battle, she brought her throne room to the battlefield. While medieval queens typically ruled from palaces, Isabella's war tent was a mobile command center that blurred the line between chapel and strategy room. Picture the scene as Spanish forces besieged Granada in 1491. The Queen's lavish pavilion stood just beyond arrow range, its crimson silk walls embroidered with gold crosses. Inside, flickering candlelight illuminated detailed siege maps spread across oak tables, while silver reliquaries holding fragments of saints' bones sat beside inkwells and compasses. This wasn't just a place to sleep, it was where a kingdom's fate was decided, with the scent of incense mixing with the tang of metal from armor being adjusted nearby. What made Isabella's tent extraordinary was how it fused faith and warfare. Where male commanders might rely solely on scouts' reports, she surrounded herself with confessors and astrologers, interpreting every skirmish through both tactical and divine lenses. Chroniclers describe her kneeling before a portable altar at dawn, then pivoting to dictate troop movements by noon, her fingers tracing supply lines on vellum maps like a general blessing a battlefield. The tent became a psychological weapon, its sheer opulence visible to Moorish defenders on Granada's walls, a daily reminder that Castile's queen wouldn't budge until their surrender. Even the tent's layout was strategic. Positioned atop a hill, its open flaps offered Isabella a panoramic view of the siege, allowing her to spot weaknesses in real time and dispatch messengers with adjustments. The artifacts inside revealed a ruler who understood symbolism as keenly as siegecraft. Alongside her battle plan sat a jeweled casket containing the Santo Grail, a supposed fragment of Christ's cross, which she displayed to visiting nobles like a spiritual warrant for her campaign. When financiers grumbled about the war's cost, she'd invite them into the tent's inner sanctum, where maps marked with Granada's riches quieted doubts. Every object served dual purposes. A gilded hourglass timed both prayer sessions and artillery volleys, while her personal copy of Ptolemy's geography texts doubled as a cipher for encoded messages. Modern historians often overlook how revolutionary this mobile court was. While other monarchs delegated military command, Isabella's presence embodied by that tent forced reluctant nobles to stay engaged. The sight of their queen enduring the same harsh conditions, eating the same soldiers' rations, silenced dissent. By the time Granada fell in 1492, the tent had become a legend in its own right, its fabric stained with candle wax and battlefield dust, a tactile record of late nights spent weighing lives against kingdoms. And when Columbus knelt before Isabella to propose his voyage, it wasn't in a palace throne room, but on the woven carpets of that same war tent, where maps of conquered territories now made space for sketches of unknown worlds. The queen who reshaped continents did so from a collapsible fortress of silk and faith, proving that real power sometimes isn't in stone walls, but in what you can carry with you. Gustav III of Sweden harbored a peculiar dread not of war or rebellion, but of coffee. In the 1780s, this caffeine-fueled anxiety reached its peak when the monarch became convinced the popular drink was poisoning his subjects. But Gustav didn't just issue a royal decree banning coffee. He designed what might be history's most absurd scientific experiment, using human lives as test subjects. His guinea pigs, a pair of convicted twins whose death sentences he commuted on one bizarre condition. One would drink 3 pots of coffee daily, the other the same amount of tea, while physicians monitored which brew killed them first. The setup was macabre theater. Gustav personally supervised the trial, appointing 2 doctors to document every tremor, every headache, every restless night. Tea had long been Sweden's aristocratic beverage of choice, while coffee, introduced by traders, was seen as a dangerous foreign vice. The king's obsession bordered on paranoia. He blamed coffee houses for revolutionary chatter and even claimed the drink caused sterility. But rather than rely on hearsay, he engineered what he believed would be definitive proof. The twins, housed in the palace infirmary, became unwilling celebrities, their vital signs logged like royal account books. Irony struck early. The tea drinker died first, not from his assigned beverage, but of old age at 83, having outlived the physicians assigned to monitor him. The coffee drinker, he thrived well into his 70s, surviving not only his twin but Gustav himself, who was assassinated at a masquerade ball long before the experiment concluded. Far from proving coffee's lethality, the trial backfired spectacularly, becoming a punchline in European courts. Yet Gustav's legacy lingers in Sweden's fika culture, where coffee breaks remain sacrosanct, a bitter brew the king couldn't suppress, no matter how many condemned men he forced to drink it. What makes this episode more than historical farce is how it reveals Enlightenment-era rulers' fraught relationship with science. Gustav framed his trial as rational inquiry, yet its design was riddled with bias. He'd already decided coffee was toxic before pouring the first cup. The physicians, keen to please their sovereign, initially recorded every minor ailment in the coffee drinker as proof of impending doom, until the data became too blatantly contradictory. Modern researchers now recognize the study as an early example of placebo effect observation, albeit one conducted with grotesque methodology. The twins' story also exposes the fragility of royal authority. Gustav, an absolutist who dressed in Roman togas to emulate emperors, thought he could decree truth into existence even about something as trivial as breakfast beverages. His failure foreshadowed a larger lesson. No king, no matter how powerful, could dictate what pleasures his subjects embraced. And in a final twist, Sweden today consumes twice as much coffee per capita as the global average, a nation of caffeine addicts whose habits outlasted the monarch who tried to purge them. The experiment's real conclusion: some obsessions are stronger than crowns. Mary, Queen of Scots, carried more than regal poise in her chambers. She hid a shameful secret in the palm of her hand. Among her personal effects discovered after her execution was a delicate glass no taller than a thimble, its capacity barely 2 ounces. This wasn't a child's curiosity or a jeweler's tool. It was the desperate prop of a monarch battling alcoholism, a tiny concession to her uncontrollable thirst. The glass's existence speaks volumes. A queen who ruled storm-tossed Scotland, endured imprisonment, and faced down Elizabeth I couldn't conquer her own craving for wine. But rather than abstain, she engineered a pathetic loophole, sipping from a vessel so small it allowed her to pretend she wasn't drinking at all. Courtiers initially mistook the miniature glass for a sentimental trinket, perhaps a gift from her first husband, Francis II of France. The truth was far darker. Mary's letters confess her struggles with the malady of spirits, as she called it, a dependency worsened by years of political turmoil. After her disastrous marriage to Lord Darnley and the scandal of his murder, wine became her crutch, but in an era when female drunkenness was seen as moral failure rather than illness, she resorted to subterfuge. Servants reported her calling for fresh glasses dozens of times an evening, each refill carefully measured to 2 ounces, just enough to maintain a steady haze while preserving the illusion of moderation. The glass itself was a masterpiece of deception. Crafted from Venetian cristallo, the thinnest and clearest glass of the 16th century, its near-invisible walls made the amount poured seem even smaller. Mary would cradle it during council meetings, the tiny sip looking like a symbolic toast rather than a needy gulp. Contemporary observers noted how her hands never shook, not from sobriety, but because the glass's size forced her to drink slowly, masking the tremors of withdrawal. It was a tragic pantomime, a queen reducing her vice to dollhouse proportions, as if the scale of the container could lessen the scale of her shame. What makes this artifact so haunting isn't just the addiction it represents, but the cultural pressure that shaped it. Male rulers like Henry VIII could boast of draining tankards without censure, but Mary's reputation hinged on maintaining feminine virtue. Even imprisoned in England, she had her tiny glass smuggled in among linens, a humiliating testament to how deeply shame had intertwined with her thirst. When her jailers finally confiscated it in 1586, citing concerns she might use the glass to signal conspirators, her frantic protests revealed more than she intended. In the end, the woman who famously said, "In my end is my beginning," left behind a legacy far more complex than martyrdom, a ruler who fought for her crown, her faith, and ultimately against the reflection in her own minuscule glass. Akbar the Great presided over a golden age of Mughal culture and conquest, yet this visionary emperor couldn't decipher a single line of the exquisite manuscripts his artisans produced. Unlike Charlemagne, who struggled publicly with illiteracy, Akbar turned his inability to read into a superpower, building an empire where knowledge flowed through ears rather than eyes. Picture the scene: dawn audiences in Fatehpur Sikri's Diwan-i-Khas, where scribes recited reports from distant provinces while Akbar absorbed every detail. His memory so precise he could recall tax figures from years past without glancing at a ledger. Where other rulers relied on written decrees, he governed through the living breath of speech, a tradition that transformed governance into performance art. The emperor's reliance on oral tradition wasn't a weakness, it was a deliberate reinvention of power. While European courts drowned in parchment, Akbar's administration thrived on real-time dialogue. His famed 9 gems advisors like Birbal and Tansen debated policy in rhythmic, memorizable phrases, turning statecraft into something closer to poetry. Farmers petitioning for relief didn't submit scrolls, they sang their grievances in structured couplets, a system Akbar designed to ensure even the illiterate masses could participate. This auditory bureaucracy reached its peak with a taslime system, where officials summarized complex data in chanted verses during moonlit courtyard gatherings. The effect was hypnotic. Statistics became stories, dry census reports transformed into epic narratives that lingered in listeners' minds long after ink would have faded. What made Akbar's approach revolutionary was how it inverted traditional hierarchies of knowledge. In a society where Persian literacy equaled privilege, his court elevated storytellers and musicians to the rank of ministers. When commissioning the Akbarnama, his monumental biography, He didn't demand a dry chronicle, he ordered it written to be performed aloud, with paintings serving as visual cues for those who couldn't read the text. Even his religious policies reflected this bias toward the spoken word. His Din-i-Ilahi syncretic faith prioritized communal recitation over scriptural study, blending Hindu mantras with Islamic dhikr in a living tapestry of sound. The irony, this supposedly illiterate ruler became history's most prolific literary patron. The Mughal scriptoriums he funded produced lavishly illustrated manuscripts, their margins wide enough for scribes to whisper translations as he traced the paintings with his fingers. Visitors marveled at how he could discuss Aristotle's philosophies or Persian epic poetry despite never reading them, a testament to the army of readers who transformed texts into oral symphonies. Modern neuroscientists might call Akbar an auditory learner, but his true genius lay in recognizing that wisdom isn't trapped in letters, it lives in the space between speaker and listener. 5 centuries later, as educators debate the merits of audiobooks versus printed text, the Mughal emperor's legacy whispers a provocative question: what if the greatest library isn't on shelves but in the human voice? Philip II of Spain didn't just build a palace, he obsessed over every brick, every beam, and every shadow in the Escorial, as if the sprawling complex were an extension of his own soul. For 36 years, from 1563 until its completion in 1599, the king transformed what should have been an architect's job into a personal crusade, poring over blueprints by candlelight and firing off hundreds of letters correcting deviations as small as a hand's width. The Escorial wasn't merely a royal residence or monastery, it was Philip's attempt to etch his piety and power into stone, a monument so grimly precise it felt less like a building and more like a fever dream given form. The king's micromanagement bordered on the surreal. He demanded window placements align perfectly with sunset angles during Vespers, ensuring divine light would frame prayer time like a staged tableau. When masons proposed decorative flourishes for courtyards, Philip ordered them pared back to brutal simplicity, insisting ornamentation distracted from God. His infamous chain of command for construction queries required every question to travel from foremen to architects to royal advisors before reaching his desk, a process that could take months, halting progress until he personally approved the type of mortar used in a single wall. Workers whispered that the king's ghost already walked the unfinished halls, his phantom footsteps echoing in corridors where real boots hadn't yet trod. What made the Escorial uniquely unsettling was how it mirrored Philip's mind. The palace-monastery hybrid, with its grid-like layout mimicking the grille of St. Lawrence's martyrdom, became a physical manifestation of his rigid worldview. Vast windowless corridors stretched like prison hallways, while the central basilica's dome loomed oppressively low, designed to force visitors into hunched reverence. Even the art collection reflected his gloom, rooms filled with El Greco's gaunt saints and Titian's tortured martyrs, their agony lit by slivers of light from arrow-slit windows. This wasn't Versailles' sun-drenched vanity, it was a fortress of sorrow where every stone whispered of death and judgment, the project's most bizarre twist. Philip's obsession with his own tomb. Years before his death, he had workers construct his funeral vault directly beneath the high altar, so priests would celebrate Mass literally over his rotting corpse. He'd visit the chilly chamber regularly, sitting on his unfinished sarcophagus to review construction updates as if rehearsing for eternity. When his beloved son died young, Philip stored the prince's body in a temporary niche for 2 decades, refusing to inter him until the Escorial's pantheon reached his exacting standards. Even decay had to wait on the king's approval. By the time the last stone was laid, the Escorial stood as both triumph and tragedy. It bankrupted Spain twice over, consumed forests of marble, and devoured countless lives, some from accidents, others from exhaustion. Yet for all his control, Philip couldn't dictate how history would remember his masterpiece. Visitors today still shudder at its oppressive grandeur, a place where sunlight feels like an intruder and every echo carries the weight of a king who believed even shadows should obey. Christina of Sweden's palace wasn't just a royal residence, it was a chaotic, living spectacle where the boundaries between ruler, court, and circus blurred daily. Visitors stepping into her chambers might find themselves dodging a pet lion as it ambled past counselors, or sharing bench space with one of her 27 monkeys, their chattering drowning out diplomatic negotiations. This wasn't just eccentricity, it was a deliberate dismantling of courtly norms, a queen who found stuffed shirts and protocol far less interesting than the raw, untamed energy of her menagerie. At the heart of this pandemonium was her beloved lion, a gift from the Ottoman Sultan that she refused to cage. Trained to eat from her hand, the beast became an unnerving participant in state affairs, its growls punctuating debates like a living gavel. Ambassadors from France once froze mid-sentence as the lion sniffed at their silk stockings, while Christina calmly assured them it only attacked when bored. The message was clear: in her court, unpredictability reigned and power didn't always wear a crown. Her fascination with dwarves was equally revelatory. Unlike other monarchs who kept them as laughingstock curiosities, Christina elevated hers to advisors and confidants. One, named Nicholas, became her chess opponent and translator, his sharp wit cutting through the sycophancy of taller courtiers. She commissioned portraits of them dressed as generals and philosophers, hanging the paintings alongside those of her noble ancestors, a visual manifesto declaring that brilliance came in all sizes. But the monkeys were her masterpiece of controlled anarchy. Imported at staggering expense from Africa and South America, they swung from chandeliers during banquets, stealing food from guests' plates and snatching wigs from bishops' heads. When outraged clergy demanded their removal, Christina quipped that they behaved better than most politicians. Their presence wasn't mere whimsy, it was political theater. By filling her palace with creatures that defied control, she exposed the pretense of courtly order, revealing how arbitrary power's rituals truly were. Modern historians often dismiss Christina's menagerie as mere quirkiness, but that misses the point. In an era when female rulers were expected to embody demure grace, her lion's roar and monkey's shrieks became acts of rebellion, proof that a queen could bend the world to her whims, even if it walked on four legs. And when she eventually abdicated, trading her throne for intellectual freedom in Rome, one wonders if she missed the chaos, the scratch of claws on marble, the weight of a lion's head in her lap, and the delicious terror in visitors' eyes when they realized this wasn't just a court. It was her kingdom of misfits where the wild and the regal were one and the same. Peter the Great didn't just modernize Russia, he waged war on beards, one bristle at a time. When the towering Tsar returned from his 18-month European tour in 1698, he brought back more than shipbuilding techniques and Dutch architecture. He carried an obsession with looking the part. To Peter, Russia's long, tangled beards weren't just facial hair. They were symbols of backwardness, physical reminders of everything he wanted to tear down. So he did what any reformist autocrat would do. He declared shaving mandatory and slapped a tax on anyone who clung to their whiskers. The beard tax of 1698 was no idle decree, it was cultural revolution by wallet. Nobles who refused to shave faced annual fines ranging from 30 to 100 rubles, sums hefty enough to bankrupt minor landowners. Peasants got off cheaper but still had to cough up a kopeck every time they entered a city, their bearded chins stamped with special tokens as proof of payment. Peter even stationed barbers at Moscow's gates, scissors at the ready, turning grooming into a state-sponsored spectacle. For traditionalists who viewed beards as sacred orthodox teachings held that man was made in God's image, and shaving defaced that likeness, the tax felt like spiritual extortion. Some merchants paid it proudly, wearing their beard tokens like badges of defiance. Others took razors to their faces with trembling hands, mourning the loss of what one chronicler called the glory of their ancestors. But Peter wasn't just trimming beards, he was uprooting an entire worldview. To him, the beard symbolized the insular, church-dominated Russia he despised, while clean-shaven faces mirrored the Western Europe he idolized. His tax collectors doubled as cultural enforcers, armed with pamphlets explaining how beards trapped food particles and bred disease. The Tsar took special delight in personally shearing his horrified boyars at court gatherings, laughing as their sacred facial hair piled on the floor. When the Patriarch of Moscow protested, Peter reportedly grabbed his beard and snipped it himself, a deliberate humiliation that shocked even his supporters. The backlash was fierce but futile. Old Believers, a conservative Orthodox sect, buried their shaven beards as if they were limbs, holding funerals for their lost dignity. Some underground barbers risked prison to preserve traditional styles, operating in cellars where clients could whisper liturgies over their fading whiskers. Yet within a generation, the unthinkable became normal. By Peter's death in 1725, smooth chins dominated St. Petersburg's elite, and the beard tax had done its job. Russia's face, much like its policies, now looked westward. What makes this slice of history so revealing isn't just Peter's audacity. It's how something as trivial as facial hair exposed the raw mechanics of power. The beard tax proved that change could be enforced not just through laws or armies, but through everyday humiliations. And in a final twist of irony, the tax receipts themselves became collectors' items, scraps of paper that outlasted the very beards they condemned. Silent witnesses to the day a Tsar decided a nation's soul could be measured in razors and rubles. Maria Theresa didn't just rule an empire, she managed a dynasty with the precision of a battlefield general and the exhaustion of a mother up to her elbows in diaper cloth. While other monarchs worried about armies and treaties, she juggled 16 pregnancies alongside reforming Austria's legal code, proving that royal nursery politics could shape nations as profoundly as any war. Her children weren't just heirs, they were diplomatic chess pieces, human bridges between empires, and sometimes, heartbreakingly, collateral in the Game of Thrones. Imagine drafting tax reforms with a toddler on your lap, or negotiating peace treaties between contractions. This was Maria Theresa's reality for 2 straight decades. The logistics alone boggle the mind. Between 1737 and 1756, she spent roughly 120 months, a full decade, either pregnant or recovering from childbirth. Yet instead of retreating to private chambers, she transformed motherhood into statecraft. Courtiers described her holding audiences with newborn in arms, wet nurses stationed discreetly behind tapestries. When Prussia's Frederick the Great sneered that Austria's queen was always lying in, he missed the point. Those very births were expanding her influence. Her daughters became queens of France, Naples, and Parma, while sons inherited titles from Milan to Tuscany. The nursery at Schönbrunn Palace wasn't just a family space, it was a war room where alliances were literally breastfed into existence. But behind the political calculations lay raw, unvarnished humanity. Maria Theresa's letters reveal a woman torn between imperial duty and maternal grief. After losing her youngest daughter to smallpox, she wore mourning black for 3 years, yet still forced herself to approve troop deployments through tears. When her eldest son, Joseph, criticized her childering methods, she fired back with a 40-page manifesto defending every sleepless night and vaccination decision. Even her famed child-sharing system, sending infants to country wet nurses to avoid distraction, was less cold pragmatism than survival strategy. "I am but one woman," she wrote, "and God has given me burdens enough for 3. The real miracle wasn't the number of children, but how she weaponized their existence. Each birth announcement was a propaganda victory, proof of Habsburg fertility and divine favor. Artists immortalized her surrounded by rosy-cheeked offspring, a living rebuttal to enemies who hoped Austria might die out. Meanwhile, Frederick the Great remained childless, his sterile marriage fueling whispers of instability. Maria Theresa's womb became her secret weapon, a biological factory producing not just babies, but a narrative of unstoppable dynastic momentum. Yet for all its triumphs, this baby boom came at a brutal cost. 4 children died young, their names etched into her diaries with ink blotted by tears. Others, like the notorious Marie Antoinette, became pawns in games they couldn't win. And Maria Theresa herself, worn out by constant pregnancies, aged dramatically in portraits, her once vibrant face lined with the toll of too many births and too little sleep. In the end, the woman who rebuilt Austria's economy and military while changing diapers left a paradoxical legacy, proof that even the mightiest empires rest on the shoulders of mothers, and that sometimes the most powerful throne is a rocking chair. King Tutankhamun's golden burial mask might have stolen the spotlight for centuries, but nestled beside his mummified body lay a weapon that turned out to be far more extraordinary, a dagger forged from the stars themselves. When archaeologists first uncovered the blade in 1925, its unrusted iron baffled experts. Ancient Egypt's Bronze Age technology shouldn't have produced such pristine metalwork. But modern science cracked the mystery. X-ray fluorescence scans revealed the dagger's composition matched meteorites found in the Red Sea region, its nickel and cobalt ratios screaming not of this earth. This wasn't just a ceremonial trinket, it was a cosmic relic hammered from a chunk of space rock that had crashed into the desert millennia before Tut's reign. The dagger's crafting speaks to a sophistication we rarely credit to ancient metallurgists. Unlike terrestrial iron, meteoritic iron is already alloyed with nickel, making it naturally resistant to corrosion. But shaping it required genius-level skill. Egyptian smiths would have worked the rare metal at low temperatures, painstakingly folding and hammering it to preserve its celestial properties, a technique far ahead of its time. The hilt, inlaid with gold and crystal, wasn't just decoration. It symbolized the union of earthly wealth and divine power. Every time Tut wore this blade, he wasn't just accessorizing, he was declaring himself armed by the gods themselves. Why would a teenage pharaoh need such an exotic weapon? The answer lies in the politics of the afterlife. Ancient texts describe iron as the bones of the gods, a material sacred enough to protect kings in the underworld. Meteorites literally falling from heaven were seen as physical proof of divine favor. By burying Tut with this blade, his advisors guaranteed he'd enter eternity wielding a fragment of the cosmos, a tool to carve through demons and assert his divinity beyond death. The irony, while Egypt's later rulers would boast of iron smelted from human hands, Tut's dagger quietly outclassed them all, its origins literally written in the stars. Recent excavations suggest this wasn't a one-off marvel. A scroll found near Tut's tomb references iron from the sky, gifted by foreign diplomats, hinting at a thriving trade in meteoritic metal. Another dagger, less pristine, was found tucked into his wrappings, likely a backup for the afterlife. But what truly stuns archaeologists is how widespread this practice might have been. A hieroglyphic term previously translated as heavenly metal now appears in texts from at least 3 other dynasties, suggesting entire workshops may have specialized in crafting celestial blades. The dagger's survival is a cosmic joke of history. While looters plundered gold and jewels, they overlooked the real treasure, a weapon too advanced for its time, too alien for thieves to recognize. Today, as it rests in Cairo's museum under climate-controlled glass, its muted gleam whispers an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the past's most revolutionary breakthroughs aren't in grand monuments, but in the quiet artifacts that defy everything we thought we knew. Tut's dagger didn't just slice through enemies, it cut straight through our assumptions about ancient ingenuity. From lion-taming queens to rulers who taxed facial hair, history's most legendary monarchs prove that power never came without peculiarities. Who could have guessed that behind the gold masks and grand portraits, these icons harbored obsessions as bizarre as their legacies were grand? Whether it was Catherine the Great's high heels literally elevating her status or Peter the Great's war on beards, every throne came with its own brand of madness. Even the mighty Charlemagne, who couldn't sign his own name, built an empire where scholarship thrived, while Marie Antoinette's tiny gambling debts became the spark that lit a revolution. The real shock isn't just how strange these secrets were, but how they reshaped the world. A queen's love of curry changed a nation's diet, an illiterate king revived Europe's literacy, and a Tsar's meteorite dagger proved ancient craftsmanship reached for the stars. These weren't just quirks, they were glimpses of the human flaws and fascinations behind the legends, reminders that history's giants still put their pants on one leg at a time. So, which fact left you speechless? Was it Cleopatra's 9 languages, Frederick the Great's midnight flute concerts, or Gustav of Sweden's caffeinated death row experiment? Drop your favorite in the comments. We'd love to hear which ruler's secret made you see history in a new light. And if you're hungry for more untold stories of kings, queens, and the astonishing truths behind their crowns, don't forget to subscribe. Because as today's journey proved, the past isn't just what's written in textbooks, it's the wild, unexpected, and utterly human stories waiting just beneath the gilded surface. Who knows what other secrets we'll uncover next?